Welcome, students. Today we'll be talking about genre. Genre is a category which helps us to classify films. For example, we have lots of films at our disposal. Now we need to put them in order. Then we'll create many shelves. So one shelf we name it thrillers, another shelf we name it romantic drama, another shelf we name it horror films, and we put our films within those shelves. So the idea is, if in future we have many other films coming too, which we don't know by now, we'll be sure that these films can be put in a particular shelf in a particular order. So primarily genres or genre, they help films to be classified. And it's seen in history that a genre particularly becomes functional when a film industry reaches a certain kind of stage of industrialization or a certain kind of corporatization. And therefore, we saw genres being very prominent during the classical Hollywood era, that is between 1920s and 1930s, whereas in Indian cinema, Indian mainstream cinema, we didn't see genre as such to be such a prominent category. Instead, in a particular film, we saw before 1990s that a single film will have many moments of generic mixtures. That is, a single film might be a family melodrama, a romantic drama, a thriller, a gangster, horror story, musical, so on and so forth. Therefore, we understand that unlike the Indian cinema of yesteryears, in case of proper generic divisions, there won't be any mixture of styles as such. So, how did this term genre came into prominence in history? It is seen that in classical Hollywood era, in Hollywood film industry, where films were not made for aesthetic purposes, but the films were made for profits. That is Hollywood industry, it was a business oriented filmmaking institution which made films for business and profit, but they kept the standard of the aesthetic standard of the films to a certain quality. Now they understood that to make the industry, the business successful, they need a regular flow of films. That is, each Friday, each week must have a certain number of films, certain number of new films coming into the market, because it can be never determined whether a film will be successful or a film will flop. Therefore, a steady number of films are to be churned out regularly. The producers then understood that it's impossible if a handful of films are to be released each Friday, it's impossible to give a new story, to tell new stories to the audience in each and every film. Therefore, there must be repetitions with variations. And also they understood that the audience, the spectator, they love certain kind of stories and they hate other kind of stories. They're indifferent to some and they are heavily involved with certain kind of films. And then it was understood that if a film is a particular commodity, if it's like any other industrial product, then the film must meet some expectation of the consumer, that is of the viewer. It must meet certain expectations and it can present few surprises also. That is, if you go to the market to buy a soap, you already know what to expect from that particular product, and those minimum expectations are to be met. The product can't surprise you by not providing it them. Similarly, in case of the cine-going public, the public needs certain kind of certainties. They must know beforehand that the money they are using to buy the ticket, for the value of their money, they must see certain things which are already known to them. One of them can be the stars. They go to see particular stars. Another is a particular standard of production, particular sceneries, landscapes, set designs, so on and so forth. But it was slowly understood that the audience also go to see a particular kind of story, and this particular kind of story determines what kind of actors will be there, what kind of narrative tensions would be there, what kind of conflicts would be there among the characters of the film, and how the film will end. Like in thrillers, we know that in thrillers there will be a conflict between the good and the bad, and definitely at the end of a thriller, the good must triumph over the bad. But this is not necessarily the expectation from a romantic drama, where we see lovers falling in love, getting separated, and getting united again. There also certain conflicts between the good and bad might happen, but that conflict is of a distinctly different quality than that of the conflict in a thriller or in a gangster film or in a film noir, supposedly. So therefore, by 1920s, when Hollywood was slowly changing from an artisanal mode of production to an industrial mode of production, the idea of genres came up. So it was understood that genres would help in many kind of ways. There are actors who might have certain kind of limitations. That is, an actor might be comfortable in a drama film and might be uncomfortable in a comedy film. So it was understood that, like the other technicians, actors, story writers, directors, music composers, they also specialized in certain kind of films. Therefore, in certain kind of films they will work well, and in certain kind of films they might not work well. And therefore it was understood that if a particular genre is kept, and if a certain actors who excel in a particular genre, they can be limited within those kind of genres, then the film will be a better product. Not only that, the the idea of a genre, it created a particular star cast. That is, when you don't expect Humphrey Bogart in a musical, or you don't expect John Wayne in a sci-fi movie, might be. So therefore, a particular genre also produces particular star casts, particular ways of using music, particular ways of using cinematography, and particular ways of using lighting. Not only that, a particular trajectory of drama. So the pleasure of the audience lied in this following of the trajectory of the narrative. So when a narrative is moving in a certain trajectory, there might be deviations. But then the pleasure lies, supposedly a film was supposed to move from A to B to C. After B, suddenly the film takes a different trajectory altogether. Then the pleasure would lie in how that narrative would come back to the familiar known point again. So in this way, Jaws, they provided a familiar universe to the audience which the audience loved, and produces certain deviations, certain surprises which would be also pleasurable. So it was a matter of proportion, how much the spectator is familiar with and how much he or she is not familiar with. And it helped to organize the industry in a certain kind of way, to create not only specialized actors or directors or technicians, but also specialized viewers in one kind of way. That is, a certain kind of viewer would regularly lap up westerns because he loves westerns. A certain kind of viewer would regularly go to watch romantic dramas because she likes romantic dramas. And in this way, there was a collateral classification of the audience too. If we go to look into the idea of genre, then we will see that genre is something which is deeply located in history. Today, we will talk about two particular genres, and we will give you certain kind of idea how the genres, the idea of genre, is not only located in a particular context of history, but it also can change when that context, either the social context or the context of time, changes along in the course of time. For example, let us talk about the Western. So when you hear the term Western, you know that this type of film will not tell you stories about the city. It will tell you stories about the countryside, the American countryside, particularly Texas, Arizona, and other places, which are dry and rather arid kind of places. And it will tell you stories of a particular time. That is when the American settlement was happening in the West, in the western side of America, because as you know, in America, the refugees and the immigrants and other settlers, they came on the eastern side from the Europe. The Western tells stories about how these settlers, they all moved towards the West and settled down in the West, where there was a loose system of governance, a loose system of law, no industrialization as such, an agricultural, pastoral, almost pastoral kind of life, a life where the main trade was that of horses and cattle, wood, so on and so forth. And it will tell the story how this rural kind of life, it was slowly moving towards an industrial kind of life. But you know that when you hear the word Western, it will also be about violence. That is the Western hero. You know how he looks like. You know that he is a cowboy hero wearing a particular kind of dress, a particular kind of hat, a particular kind of denim jeans, and also carries holsters with guns in it. And this man, many a times, is seen in the horseback. The characters are seen in the horseback because this was a place where horses was a primary means of conveyance.
And Frank?
Frank sent us.
Did you bring a horse for me?
Well, looks like we're... looks like we're shy of one horse.
You brought two too many.
So, in a way, not only the landscape, not only the characters, but also their dresses, but also their speech, they also get defined in a genre. And you know that the Western hero won't talk like a smart city man, and the Western will be filled with characters who are very archetypal, typical rural kind of characters. Now, this Western, it told the story of American settlement. And slowly, it was seen that the Western is allegorically telling stories of the coming into being of America as a new continent. For example, in a film like Stagecoach. So, if you watch John Ford's 1939 film, which is called The Stagecoach, you will see that this film is telling the story of a journey in the middle of a desert from one town to another. And the stagecoach is filled up with people who are of low origins or have certain kind of disrepute attached to them, infamous for a certain kind of way, faulty characters. And we see in this film how this group of faulty characters, they slowly become the hero. They slowly become the hero in the onslaught of the violent Red Indians, and how they help the cavalry, the US cavalry, that is the US Army, to battle the Red Indians, and they reach a certain kind of redemption.
Why don't you take the cuffs off the kid? He's mighty handy with a gun. You drive them horses. I'll take care of the kid. The man works all his life to get a hold of some money so that he can enjoy life. Please.
Take it easy, Gatewood. We may need that fighting before we get to the ferry.
You wouldn't be much good in a fight, you jailbird. Oh, leave the kid alone. He's handcuffed.
when we hear this kind of story, we understand that this kind of story is a kind of allegory, because it is telling the story of America's coming into being. How in America, people from Europe who didn't have their fortunes in Europe, they kind of settled here to make a fresh new start in life. But as usual, within this kind of allegorical stories, there were certain political incorrectness. Like, you always present Red Indians, who were the main inhabitants of America, as the villain. And you tend not to show black characters or characters of African American origin. So it was entirely a white, Anglo-Saxon, Caucasian world whose story you were being told to. By 1955, it was shown that when classical Hollywood phase, it was coming to an end because of certain events, the Western was slowly changing. So in 1955, we have John Ford's The Searchers, whose film Stagecoach we mentioned earlier, where we see John Ford suddenly creating a world which questions the basic propositions of the Western, the basic certainties of the Western. Because in this film, we see that the hero, who is a white man, and a villain, who is a Red Indian chief, they are almost mirroring each other. They are equally sadistic, equally violent, equally cruel. So in this way, John Ford starts questioning the genre called Western in its own kind of way, and thus begins a phase which we generally called the revisionist Western. That is the Western which will revision its earlier visions.
Death song. War chief, he's got it to save face. Yes, sir, he'll be right in your lap in a minute, Sonny.
That which we are about to receive, we thank thee, O Lord.
Let's go! Let's go!
Now, Western has a particularly interesting story to offer. By 1960s, it was heard that far away in Italy, filmmakers were making Westerns. Now, this is a very peculiar thing to happen, because the Western is a very American category. It tells stories about American past, about the American 19th century. But we see that in Italy, because Westerns were very popular in Italy, they were making local Westerns. And these films were derogatorily termed spaghetti Westerns. Now, the spaghetti Westerns, since they were made by Italians who were in love with American cinema, but not necessarily in love with American national identity, what they did was particularly interesting. They increased the amount of violence in the films. So in other Westerns, in American classical Westerns, we see the entire story moving towards a moment when there is a violent shootout where the good triumphs over the evil. But the Italians who loved seeing this kind of films, primarily a filmmaker like Sergio Leone or Sergio Corbucci, they made films where we see that this violent shootouts is happening almost in every 15 minutes of the film. And therefore, it created a very brutal world. Now, ironically, we see that if you go back to the history proper, that the Wild West, it was called the Wild West because it had almost zero presence of law there. The West actually was as violent as they were shown in the spaghetti Westerns than in the classical phase of the Westerns. Then we understand that just Americans, they were so much attached to the national identity, they created a rather sanitized, a rather safe picture of America in the classical phase of Westerns. Whereas the Italians, who had no kind of association with the American identity. They were more truthful to the actual history which happened out there. So obviously, spaghetti westerns which were made in Italy, they were looked down upon derogatorily by the Hollywood filmmakers. But these westerns, they brought in such a new novelty in the entire arena of the western, that when the westerns were again, when they were again started being made in America, they couldn't actually escape the influence of the spaghetti westerns. Now, if you today Google top 10 westerns or top 20 westerns, then you will be presented a list of films, and you will see that within the first 5 films there will be definitely a film like Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, or Once Upon a Time in the West, or Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, so on and so forth. Therefore, it says that how the spaghetti western, it actually gained a certain amount of prestige over the course of time, and in a strange kind of way, Italian kind of production, they started defining a genre which is definitely American. So in this way, we see that the certain strange anecdotes of a genre can actually be discovered, and therefore, in connection with the Western, a perplexing question which arrives, that why did the Western vanish by 1970s? Because after 1970s, we hardly see any Westerns are being made. So in this way, the longest running genre, one of the most successful genre, in a once fine morning, in a one sudden decade, might turn out to be utterly irrelevant, because people are not interested in those stories anymore. In this way, the genre has a life of its own. So now when westerns are being made again, it will always have an idea of looking back and at how the earlier films were like. So it creates a sort of film which we call pastiche. That is a kind of as a kind of film which tries to resemble the older films. So how can a genre be replicated? Like we talked about in case of the Western, that now if we make Westerns, they would be definitely period pieces, a certain kind of films which will try to look like older kind of films. This point also brings us to notice, throws into sharp relief, that a genre also has a particular style, a style which can be replicated again and again. Like if we talk about the noir, the term film noir is associated with a particularly gritty, dark, morally ambiguous kind of world, which is not only known because of its particular kind of characters you see, but primarily known because of a particular cinematography, particular lighting style, which is evident in this kind of films. And therefore, if you see a film like that of Night of the Hunter, John Huston's Night of the Hunter, then you will see that this film is a fairy tale. This film, in the protagonist of this film is a couple of children. And we see that since this film is shot in the way the noir is shot, that is using high contrast cinematography, a rather complicated pattern of light and shade, and a particular way of lighting the faces of the character, where half the face of the character is lit, and a strong use of shadows, a strong use of zonal lighting, we'll see that even in case of a fairy tale, a children's fairy tale, a particularly adult style of noir can be used.
Lean on Jesus, lean on Jesus, leaning on the everlasting arms.
Shame on you, Ruby. Running around the house after that mad dog of a man. Miss Flans. Ruby, go get the children out of bed and bring them down here. Women are such germ fools.
And in this way, we see that genres, they also present a particular kind of style. So you don't expect this kind of lighting. The lighting you expect in Noah, you don't expect that in a romantic comedy. You don't expect that in a musical where things are more brighter, where things are more cheerful and everything is properly lit and where there will be more color. So genre is not only giving us a particular category of story, a particular category of stars, a particular use of soundtrack, a particular style of things, but it also gives us a certain known universe, a known universe which can refer to one another. So one film Noah can refer to another film Noah, one western can refer to another western, one gangster film can refer to another gangster film. And it creates a very specialized viewers. If a viewer is attached to a particular kind of genre, then the viewer also gets a bit of empowered that he has special knowledge about the genre and which will lead him again to again whenever this generic film will be released in the theatre, thus creating a stable commercial system. So to conclude, a genre is a classificatory category. It helps us to classify films. It helps us to know films in a particular kind of way. So idea of the genre helps us to understand the textual universe of the genre too. If we know that a particular film falls under a particular category, then we understand that the universe of what the universe of the film looks like. These days, genres are often mixed, but that's another topic altogether. And we are in a particularly exciting era now where we can see generic tendencies mixing together, but that will be the discussion of another lecture.